She came close to me, her cheeks brushing against mine so slightly and softly. It felt so good as she ran her hands through my underskirt. I felt such a soft touch, a touch so sweet and tender, I couldn't resist. I opened up and gave way to let it happen. This is the story of two nuns who fell in love and changed the trajectory of their lives with the decisions they made. Claire was 29, and Jean, the older nun, was 40. Just two nuns who fell in love with each other. Or was it just lust and the feeling of being wanted and cherished by someone else? As a little girl, Claire begins, I remember sitting in the front pew at church, watching the nuns and their habits. To me, they seemed so serene, so sure of their purpose. I wanted that, to feel that kind of certainty. At 19, Claire answered what she believed was her calling, joining the convent and taking her vows. She recalls the early days fondly. The quiet mornings spent in prayer, the sense of fulfillment in serving others, and the deep camaraderie among her fellow sisters. For decades, Claire lived with a singular focus: prayer, teaching, helping the poor. She thought she had found the meaning of her life. But she confesses that even in the stillness of her days, there was an undercurrent of restlessness, a feeling she couldn't name but could never fully ignore. I thought I knew my purpose, Claire reflects, her voice soft but firm, to serve God, to find fulfillment in faith. But life has a way of revealing truths you didn't even know were there. The convent, a place of serene rituals and unwavering devotion, was Claire's entire world for decades. From her teenage years to adulthood, its walls shaped her life, her purpose, and her sense of belonging. But even in its calmness, there was a restlessness, an ache she couldn't explain. Every day began the same. The soft chime of the bell would pull her from sleep before dawn, summoning her to prayer. The chapel, lit by flickering candlelight, always felt otherworldly in those early hours. Claire knelt there, head bowed, the familiar rhythm of the prayers grounding her. The silence was supposed to be sacred, Claire recounts, and most days it was. But there were times it felt heavy, suffocating, as if the stillness held questions she wasn't ready to answer. Her days followed a carefully choreographed routine: silent meditation, teaching children from underprivileged communities, tending to the elderly, and helping with meals. Claire often found peace in her work, moments where her heart swelled with the sense of doing God's work. Yet, beneath the surface, a longing stirred, a quiet discontent she couldn't name. She told herself it was just a phase, a trial of faith. After all, even the most devout face moments of doubt. And so Claire kept busy, throwing herself into her duties. She prayed harder, served with greater diligence, and pushed down the flicker of unease. But then, one day, something happened that would change everything. It began at the church's community center, where Claire often helped with outreach programs. The center was a lively place, brimming with chatter, laughter, and the bustle of volunteers. It was here she met Jean, a former nun who had already left the convent. Jean, she was different. Jean was in her late 40s, a woman who seemed to radiate warmth and confidence. She was outspoken, passionate, and unapologetically herself. It didn't take long for Claire to learn that Jean was also openly queer, something Jean carried with a quiet dignity that struck Claire deeply. When she smiled, it was as if she could see right through you, Claire admits. I'd never met anyone like her. Their first interaction was casual, unremarkable even. A spilled cup of coffee and a shared laugh. But something about Jean lingered. Claire couldn't quite place it. Over time, their paths crossed more often. The conversations that began with casual banter soon grew deeper. She'd talk about life, her beliefs, and the people she cared for, Claire reflected. Jean had this way of drawing you in, making you feel seen, as if you were the only person in the room. Claire found herself looking forward to these moments, those stolen snippets of conversation, the warmth of Jean's presence. She told herself it was admiration, nothing more. After all, how could it be anything else? But something about Jean stirred questions Claire had long buried. She admired Jean's strength, the way she moved through the world without apology, without fear. Claire thought that was all it was. But deep down, she knew better. And so began the quiet unraveling. What started as a friendship began to stir something deeper within Claire, a feeling she couldn't yet name but could no longer ignore. Claire's days at the convent had always been predictable, anchored by routines and rituals that gave her a sense of purpose. But Jean's presence disrupted that rhythm in ways Claire could no longer ignore. Her questions stayed with me, Claire narrates, not just in the moment, but long after our conversations ended. They lingered, weaving into my prayers, my thoughts, my very being. Jean had a way of peeling back the layers of Claire's carefully constructed world. She'd ask things like, "Do you ever feel like there's more out there, Claire? Something beyond the life you've always known?" At first, Claire dismissed these questions, brushing them off with well-rehearsed answers about faith and duty. But as the days turned into weeks, she began to feel the cracks forming. She made me think about my vows in a way I never had before, Claire admits. Were they a choice? Or just something I'd accepted because I thought it was what God wanted for me? Their bond deepened with every interaction. Claire found herself seeking out Jean's presence, her laughter, the way she seemed to bring light into every room. And yet, each moment spent with Jean only magnified the weight of Claire's vows, the silent promises that governed her life. Then came the night that changed everything. It was after an outreach event at the community center. The two women lingered long after the other volunteers had gone home, tidying up in the warm glow of the setting sun. The air was thick with unspoken words as they worked side by side, the silence punctuated only by the occasional clatter of chairs being stacked. "Claire," Jean began, her voice hesitant, almost trembling. Claire stopped what she was doing and turned to face her. "I know this might be impossible," Jean said, her eyes searching Claire's face. "But I feel something for you. Something more than friendship." For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Claire could hear the faint hum of traffic outside, the distant chirp of crickets. But all she could focus on was Jean, the vulnerability in her voice, the raw honesty in her eyes. "I didn't know what to say," Claire recalls, her voice heavy with emotion. "It was as if my entire world had been flipped upside down." She wanted to deny it, to tell Jean that such feelings were unthinkable, impossible. But deep down, Claire knew the truth. She felt it too. Instead of answering, Claire retreated. She left the community center that night without saying much, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. Back at the convent, Claire threw herself into prayer, seeking clarity, begging for answers. She knelt before the altar, her hands clasped tightly, tears streaming down her face. "I asked God to take these feelings away," Claire narrates, "to make me whole again, to remind me of my purpose." But the feelings didn't go away. If anything, they grew stronger. The more Claire tried to push them aside, the more they consumed her. "It felt like a betrayal," she confesses, her voice cracking, "to God, to my community, to everything I had built my life around. But it also felt like the truth." Jean's confession had opened a door Claire couldn't close. She was no longer just a nun serving her community. She was a woman wrestling with love, faith, and the unshakable pull of her own heart. And so, the conflict began. The church was silent that morning, its stone walls bathed in the muted light filtering through stained glass windows. Claire sat in the pew, hands folded in her lap, as the priest spoke of love and sacrifice. His voice echoed through the vast space, each word carrying a weight that Claire could feel pressing against her chest. He talked of selflessness, of giving oneself entirely to God, of forsaking earthly attachments for a higher purpose. Claire had heard sermons like this countless times before, but today, the words rang hollow. "I had always thought of love as something pure, something divine," Claire narrates. "But in that moment, I realized that the love I was being asked to uphold came with conditions. It was a love that demanded denial, not just of myself, but of others like me who sought nothing more than to live authentically." As the sermon continued, Claire's thoughts spiraled. She thought about Jean, her smile, her laughter, the way she had awakened something in Claire that she didn't even know was there. She thought about the rules, the vows, the sacrifices she had made, and the hypocrisy she had witnessed within the very institution she had devoted her life to. How could we preach about love, Claire reflects, her voice heavy with emotion, while turning a blind eye to the pain and suffering caused by those very teachings? How could we condemn the love I felt for Jean while ignoring the injustices happening all around us? The moment of clarity came like a jolt. It wasn't anger or rebellion. It was a quiet, resolute understanding. I realized I had been living a lie, Claire says, not because I didn't believe in love, but because I had been denying the love that was right in front of me. And that was the real betrayal. That night, Claire made her decision. The convent was silent, the hallways dark and still as she moved quietly through the space that had been her home for decades. She returned to her small room, where the walls were bare except for a crucifix and a few personal belongings. I didn't take much, Claire narrates. Just a change of clothes, a few mementos, and a well-worn Bible. It wasn't about leaving behind the material. It was about leaving behind the weight of a life that no longer felt like mine. Sitting at her desk, Claire pinned a letter to the Mother Superior. The words didn't come easily, but she wrote with honesty and conviction. I explained that this wasn't about abandoning my faith, she recalls. It was about embracing a part of myself that I could no longer deny. I told her I was grateful for the life I had lived within the church, but it was time for me to step into a different kind of truth. As she signed her name, Claire felt a mix of fear and relief. She folded the letter, placed it on her desk, and slipped quietly out of the convent. The air outside was crisp and cool, carrying with it the faint scent of autumn leaves. For the first time in years, Claire felt untethered, free, but also deeply uncertain. She clutched her small bag tightly as she made her way through the dimly lit streets, her heart pounding with every step. I didn't know what I would say, Claire admits. I didn't even know if she would open the door, but I knew I had to try. Jean's home was modest, tucked away on a quiet street. Claire hesitated for a moment before knocking, her hand trembling slightly. When the door opened, Jean stood there in a simple sweater and jeans, her expression shifting from confusion to surprise to something else, hope. Claire, Jean said, her voice tinged with disbelief. Claire looked at her, her eyes welling with tears but her voice steady. I can't deny it anymore, she said. I choose you. For a moment, there was only silence, the two women standing in the soft glow of the porch light. Then, Jean stepped aside, her face breaking into a smile as she motioned for Claire to come in. Just as she hugged me, I felt at home. Her tight hug felt like peace and comfort and all the love in the world. I felt as if something new was taking over me, but in the best ways possible, a feeling I've never had. She came close to me, her cheeks brushing against mine so slightly and softly. Then she touched me gently and stroked on my skin over my shoulders so tenderly. I was enjoying every bit of it. A new feeling. A great feeling. My body trembled as she touched my legs. Then slowly but firmly, she led me to the couch, her soft touch making me feel intense pleasure. It felt so good as she ran her hands through my underskirt. I felt such a soft touch, a touch so sweet and tender, I couldn't resist. I opened up and gave way to let it happen. It was the best night of my life. I reached heights and felt things inside me I never knew existed. I didn't know what would come next, Claire narrates, her voice filled with quiet wonder. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the unknown. I was ready to face it, with her. That evening, and all night long we were at it. Sweet love making. I never knew what this felt like. But it was amazing, and I never wanted it to stop. I had always thought about what it felt like to be touched by the hands of someone else. What it felt like to feel her lips on mine. Her lips were so soft. She tenderly kissed me on my neck. From my neck, she went all the way down to my belly button, as each piece of cloth went off. Then she tenderly kissed my thighs. I felt like I was about to explode. I didn't even know what that feeling was. I couldn't explain it. It was all new to me, but it was all perfect, better than anything I had ever dreamed about or imagined. The way she looked at my body, the sweet words, the tender kiss and touches, I was in another realm. It was such a long night, and I never wanted it to end. It was literally the best night of my life. I had braced myself for resistance, Claire narrates, but nothing could have prepared me for the depth of it. People I had loved and respected for years suddenly looked at me like a stranger, or worse, a traitor. Former colleagues from the church were the first to respond. Whispers spread like wildfire through the religious community, thinly veiled disapproval wrapped in polite phrases. Claire's decision wasn't just seen as a personal failing. It was painted as a betrayal of God himself. They accused me of abandoning my faith, Claire says, her voice tinged with pain, of turning my back on the vows I had made. But what they didn't understand was that I wasn't turning away from God. I was finally living the truth of what I believed faith should be, love in its purest form. Her family's reaction was harder to bear. Her parents, devout Catholics who had once celebrated her calling to the church, were devastated. My mother cried when I told her, Claire recalls. She said she didn't understand how I could throw it all away. My father wouldn't even speak to me for weeks. It felt like I had shattered their faith along with my own. For the first time in decades, Claire found herself without a home, without a community, and without the safety net the church had always provided. Life outside the convent was chaotic, Claire narrates. I had no income, no plan. I had spent so long following a routine, waking before dawn, praying, teaching, serving others, that I didn't know how to structure my days. The freedom I had craved felt overwhelming at first, like I had been handed the keys to a world I didn't know how to navigate. Jean became her lifeline. Jean didn't just welcome me into her home, Claire says. She welcomed me into her world, a world where love wasn't conditional, where being yourself wasn't something you had to apologize for. Jean helped Claire adjust to life beyond the church's walls. She encouraged Claire to explore new hobbies, to think about what she wanted for herself instead of what others expected. Jean's unwavering support gave Claire the courage to face the practical challenges too, finding work, managing finances, and building a life from scratch. It wasn't easy, Claire admits. There were nights when I lay awake, wondering if I had made the right choice. I missed the structure of the convent, the certainty of it all. But then I'd look at Jean, her kindness, her strength, the way she saw me, truly saw me, and I knew I couldn't go back. Not to a life where I had to hide who I was. The backlash didn't fade overnight. Claire received letters from former parishioners, some expressing heartbreak, others outright condemning her. Social media, once a tool she barely used, became a battleground of opinions about her decision. I learned quickly not to read the comments, Claire narrates with a chuckle. The world has no shortage of opinions, especially when it comes to love and faith. But through the chaos, Claire began to find her footing. She discovered a resilience she hadn't known she possessed, one that came not from the church's teachings, but from her own heart. I realized something crucial, Claire says, her voice steady. For so long, I had seen myself only as a servant of God. But I'm more than that. I'm a whole person, with my own desires, my own truths. And those truths are worth fighting for. Jean, Claire recounts, was instrumental in helping her redefine her faith. They would spend long evenings talking about spirituality, love, and what it means to live authentically. Jean taught me that love isn't something to be ashamed of, Claire says, her tone soft but firm. It's something to cherish, to fight for. And in fighting for our love, I found a kind of faith I had never known before, a faith rooted in honesty and courage. I lost a lot when I left the church, Claire admits, but what I gained was worth so much more. For the first time in my life, I'm not just surviving, I'm living. The hardest part of my journey wasn't leaving the convent, Claire says. It was learning how to live in the world as my true self, without shame, without fear, and without apology. Her reflection is both introspective and outwardly focused. She recounts how the pain of her departure, her family's rejection, the judgment from former colleagues, transformed into a source of strength. I had spent so much of my life trying to fit into a mold, Claire says, but breaking free from it taught me something profound. The rules we're given aren't always right. Sometimes, faith isn't about obedience. It's about courage. The courage to ask questions, to challenge injustices, and to live authentically. Claire's journey didn't end when she walked out of the convent. In many ways, it was just beginning. At first, I thought I could leave it all behind. The church, my vows, the life I had known for decades, Claire narrates. But I soon realized that my story wasn't just mine. There were others like me, trapped by fear and expectations, longing for a way out. This realization sparked a new calling. Claire began to speak out, sharing her story with anyone who would listen. She reached out to LGBTQ+ groups within religious communities, offering support and guidance to those struggling with their identities. I wanted them to know they weren't alone, Claire says, that there is a way to reconcile faith and love without sacrificing one for the other. Her advocacy work wasn't always welcomed. Claire recalls the hostile letters, the cold shoulders from former friends, and the backlash from conservative voices within the church. There were times I wondered if I was doing the right thing, Claire admits, but then I'd get an email from someone thanking me for giving them hope, or I'd meet someone who said my story helped them find the strength to come out, and I knew I couldn't stop. Claire also continues to reflect on how her faith has evolved. I still have faith, she says, her tone soft but unwavering. But it's different now. It's no longer about rules or dogma. It's about connection. Connection to others, to the world, and to the love that binds us all. That's what faith means to me now. Living authentically and loving fully. Jean, Claire recounts, has been by her side every step of the way. Their love, once a source of conflict and fear, has become a wellspring of strength and inspiration. She reminds me every day that love isn't something to be hidden. It's something to celebrate, Claire says. And together, we've built a life rooted in honesty and compassion. To anyone who feels trapped by expectations, whether they're religious, societal, or self-imposed, I want you to know this. You have the right to love and be loved, Claire says, her voice imbued with hope. Love isn't something to fear. It's something to fight for, even when it means taking risks, even when it means stepping into the unknown. Sometimes, love requires us to take a leap of faith. And when we do, we find not only love but also freedom. Freedom to be who we truly are. Claire says, for the first time, I feel free, not because I left the church, but because I found the courage to embrace the truth.